go. All right. Welcome to the Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference, the 12th annual. I'm Leah Langby from the IFLIS Library System in Eau Claire, and I also have Angela Schneider here with me as a moderator. We're very glad to welcome you here today. Glad that you chose this session and are joining us. Today's presenter is David McHugh. He works for the University of Wisconsin-Madison's iSchool, and he's a big game aficionado, and he'll be talking about board games in the library. David, when you're ready, I'll just let you take it away.
Thanks so much, Leah. Well, I'm very happy to be here and great to see everyone. Good turnout and already lots of good ideas and suggestions in the chat. I will have a list of board games at the end, not by any means a comprehensive one, so I encourage you to take some notes from what other people are saying as well. Most of the ones I'll reference today in the presentation will make it into my Google Doc at the end, but not quite all, but the slides will be available as well. So this is a lovely library picture I grabbed online, been shared by Rochester, Minnesota Public Library. And just a nice, simple display and worked well as a title. We're going to talk about a variety of different things because I could happily talk about board games literally all day. So I'm going to try to keep our scope a little bit more narrowed there. I appreciate that the ALA has said that libraries are about stories and information, not specifically books, and that these are another type of format for stories. And we all know that fictional experiences can be very personally meaningful and different things like that. So that's part of why we care about this, as well as there's a surge in gaming. It's big business is trying to get some estimates for just how big it is and what the demand is these days, and it varies a lot. But it's more than a few billion per year. The best metric I found, not the best, but a metric that I found in terms of how much is about the equivalent of like 3 Taylor Swift Eras tours, which makes it slightly more comprehensible to me just because that's about the biggest thing that I sort of understand what it is in terms of economic impact. So I think that's going to be the new standard in terms of economic measures, but it's a lot. And like we've been seeing in the chat, games encompasses so much, right? We've got classics like euchre. Here in this picture, we've got all the way from super basic games, tic-tac-toe, to my current favorite board game, which weighs 36 pounds, which is truly excessive. It's larger than 2 of my children, though I only love it half as much, and takes a considerable amount of time to set up and play. But it's delightful. Frosthaven, part of the Gloomhaven series. Let's see, we'll talk about a good amount about the specifics for like whys and hows and how do we actually do this in a library setting. And I'll give you some resources to hopefully make it a little bit easier to make some of these decisions and thinking points as we go through. I'm going to focus mostly on, in terms of definition, kind of the newer modern games, so things from the last 25 years or so. There are a lot of classic games from before then, and I'm just going to keep those a little bit out of scope because I feel like a lot of folks grew up more with those. So we'll talk about things that are new-ish, and partly because I'm aging at a considerable rate, and partly because I want to do games that stand the test of time. Most of the games I recommend are not going to be brand new, but new-ish, and ones that have held up pretty well over the last handful of years. A little bit of trivia to get us started off. So just share answers in the chat. No searching. This is not a well-balanced game itself. The answers are pretty loose. I don't have precise numbers for us here. There are some prizes, however, at the end. So the stakes are high. In addition to the regular glory that you get for winning online webinar trivia, there is a prize and several. In fact, so the first one is, why was Monopoly created? What was the original intent of the game? Then the second one is, how many new board games approximately are created every year, or in a current year, because it varies year to year. And so how many games do we think exist out there in the world, in the wild? How many types of board games are there? And I'll give us a moment for people to drop these in the chat before I get back to our answers. I don't expect anyone to know any of these other than maybe the trivia around the history of Monopoly. Good guesses, good guesses. I'm seeing some correct ones for Monopoly. Roughly, it was originally called the Landlord game and was about how monopolies are bad. and bad for everyone. But the less competitive version was maybe less fun to play or certainly harder to sell. So they kind of cropped that part out. But it was a pretty interesting one and a way to see how games can try to convey different messages. And sometimes that works and sometimes that doesn't. And sometimes they get co-opted in a variety of interesting ways. All right, so last chances for the other guesses before I read out the best that I could tell from a not super huge amount of searching. So for 2022, where the numbers are a little bit more solid, there were more than 5,000 new games, just new ones. Granted, part of the reason this is a very squishy definition is that there are expansions, there are second printings of games where they fix some issues with the first one. There are a lot of different things, and it can be tricky to figure out what are we even talking about here? What are we defining as a new game? But definitely in the thousands, quite a bit. There were more than 3,000 planned just for 2023 before 2023 was over. So I don't know what the final numbers might be, or again, how exactly we measure that, but it's a lot. And so for games in the world, 140,000 plus are how many are on Board Game Geek, which is a pretty handy resource, kind of like the Wikipedia of board games. This is referring to board games pretty broadly, so not video games. It does include many card games, right? The borders are pretty blurry there. I don't know if it encompasses like tabletop RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons. I think not. But good questions there in the chat. So there's a lot going on here. It's more than any of us can keep track of fully, and that's okay. It's an exciting time to be interested in games. Since you're all here, I'm going to assume we have some level of interest in games to begin with, so I'll be kind of brief on these, but still worth talking about. Games can be truly beautiful. I really like these. Sagrada is one that I recommend. I quite like it. It's based on the Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Spain, and you use colorful dice to try to match different patterns, a little bit of a Sudoku kind of feel as you're trying to get things to match up in ways that give you points. It is technically competitive, but not one where you can really screw over your opponents, which I appreciate because there are some friends where I can't play competitive games with them because they become unpleasant. But this one works well for pretty much all groups and audiences there. The second one is Azul, which I've heard wonderful things about. I've not actually played, but more of a tile making game and quite lovely. Here are another couple as we just think about games using art directly as part of the gameplay. Again, we've got Dixit in the lower left, and there are a bunch of different versions of that. And then Mysterium in the upper right, which is directly a hybrid of Dixit and Clue. So Dixit is a game like Apples to Apples, but with pictures. So one person, whoever's turn it is, which rotates, says something that describes one of their cards and puts their card secretly down. Everyone picks a picture from their deck that they think matches, and then people vote to see which one they thought was the original, the one that inspired whatever sentence or phrase the person put out there. So it could be winning, and someone would put in that dice one. Probably a little more obscure because everyone's trying to play the best card, and the person who played it wants not everyone to get it. It shouldn't be too obvious. And then Mysterium is Clue, but you're using these beautiful cards as clues for the ghost who's trying to help you catch their killer. So you're trying to figure out, was it Colonel Mustard in the library with the lead pipe type of thing, but with these beautiful and kind of creepy cards. So in the upper right, you've got this polar bear / owl reading a book. And so if you play that, that might be some clues. Is it the person holding the book, or is it the person with the bird in the background? What's going on here? And it's a cooperative game that uses the art well. So I love those. There's just so many creative things going on now. And yes, I have some friends who play way too much Mysterium, and so they have to do house rules to make it just much, much harder and a lot more things to figure out. But a lovely game. One of my areas of interest, particular interest, is games for learning. So in education, both formal education like K-12 and higher education, where to work, and in the library and at home and different settings like that. So we use games in my family. I've got 3 little kids, oldest of which is 6, to help them learn how to both win and lose gracefully. And that can take a while. And we're having some good luck with it through games, and games that are made to be hard, or you're not supposed to win every time. And so that's great. And also for things like literacy and generally empowering learners to be able to feel like they can solve interesting problems and understand systems and explore. Games are just a nicely safe place to take some risks that you can't necessarily face to face, because especially to use a video game analogy, if you're playing Mario and you die a million times, well, that's part of the game. That's fine. As opposed to sometimes in education where it's like, I failed the quiz, I'm doomed. And so games can be a nice playful way to engage with a variety of things that otherwise can sometimes be intimidating. They can explore systems. I really like the evolution game featured in the lower left, where you're evolving and adapting these creatures to compete over the limited food supply. And sometimes the food supply is the other players if you evolve a carnivore. And so it's a really interesting way to see how just a couple of these metrics can influence an ecosystem. And they have a climate change expansion pack that does some interesting things there as things heat up or cool down and what that does to the different creatures and how they need to evolve. So that's a delightful one, though pretty competitive, because if you're eating your friends or patrons in the game, people don't always like that. Various types of problem solving, and one of the biggest categories for there are social skills, right? A really great practice both for young people and people of all ages to do social deduction together. There's cooperative games where you're learning and solving things together, as opposed to more competitive ones, with also frequently require social skills. So I want to make an alliance with you. I want you to trade with me, even though you know that I'm trying to defeat you. And how do we negotiate this, and how do we work through that? Let's see, there's Decorum is another one I listed here. That was a winning game for the G Learning Game Awards, which I co-founded and co-run every year. So that's fun. Mostly not board games, mostly video games, but different educational games. And that was a winner in, I think, 2022. It's called a game of passive-aggressive cohabitation. So it's a hidden knowledge game, so you don't know what the other person's goals are, but you still need to compromise to be able to furnish this house. And so it has some interesting social elements there where it's collaborative, but you have different goals. And then Daybreak in the lower right, a beautiful upcoming, I don't think it's fully out yet, but it's been on Kickstarter and some of those, optimistic problem-solving game about climate change and how can we make the world a better place. So I appreciate those. There's a lot of interesting things going on there. Lastly, for our whys, games for meaning. We've got Parks and Rec in the lower left as one of the main characters loses his mind a little bit while unemployed and builds a gigantic game and has some interesting ripple effects in the show. In the center, two of my children who are trying to seize the cards for the game Pandemic. It has shiny cubes and lots of cards, and we played that a lot in the pandemic. Maybe too soon in terms of a theme, but it is a very good cooperative game as you're trying to contain contagion around the world. The last one I was tinkering with and had an AI spit on image trying to convey Dungeons and Dragons and therapy, which is a real thing that a number of therapists have done, and often with great effects, because you can get people into different situations to practice things, to role play things, to take on different positions and perspectives and work through that. I also have some friends who do a lot of Dungeons and Dragons and stuff, and who have had, really just broke down weeping at sessions because of the meaningful things that are happening, and as they work through different themes of loss and trauma and redemption and different things that were very meaningful to them. So that's another one. Again, fiction can be powerful stuff, and creativity. And yeah, Parks and Rec, always great for the library references, right? All right, so why am I the one talking about this today? First up, shout out to John Pappas, who's going to speak about this. And so I'm lucky to jump to those shoes, but I hear excellent things about his work. Keep an eye out for his stuff. I do teach, as Leah mentioned, at the iSchool here in UW-Madison, a truly wonderful thing for me, hopefully wonderful for my students as well. I am working on pitching a Games and Libraries course here that there's some excitement working up to that. Let's see, I worked for DPI for a decade, so I'm sure I encountered some of you when I was running BadgerLink quite a while ago. Shout out to the BadgerLink team for the fantastic stuff that they put out there into the world. I got to be DPI's first games and learning liaison, trying to make some connections and build things up around the state, which mostly for me took the form of co-founding the annual Play, Make, Learn conference with lots of makerspace and creative things around creative learning in libraries and K-12, but also some other situations. So check that out if you're interested. It's in Madison every year. Just one of the other arenas where I get to geek out. And the G Learning Game Awards gets kind of paired in with that. And check out our website if you're curious what sort of games have won before. And we'll be doing that at the conference again this year. But I try to infuse games into everything that I do to some extent, because I think it is really great for how our brains work, how we make connections to people and concepts and remember, how we play and learn and all of that. And then, of course, I get lots of practice with the 3 little kids at home. That comes up a lot. But let's get down to brass tacks and ins and outs and particular things as you are thinking about how to do more with games in your library. We've looked at the why, so we can breeze past that. Think about next for who is your audience. And this can really vary. So I recommend building on what audiences you already know in your community and what needs they have for the library, for the community. Games are expensive hobby on average for individuals, which is a really great opportunity for libraries to help fill that need. I did do the trolley problem game on this one. Can't say it's a specific recommendation because I don't remember how appropriate all the cards are. I suspect, knowing the source, that not all of them, but it is about the philosophical trolley problem and trying to steer the train, which track do send it down, and adding creative things to both sides. So creative one, and fit the theme of the questions here. Wanted something a little bit more current than like Guess Who. But think about the audience. There's a huge demand on the young end of the spectrum and the kids games. And then there are the other end of the spectrum for people my age and up, and all ages, for the different types of games, depending on level of complexity, depending on theme and type. So only you can answer the who question, but I think there's a lot of opportunities there for a variety of ages. I know some librarians who've also really focused on it as a way to bring folks to the library where they tend to drop off the age or after they graduate from school, and if they don't have kids and things like that, where it tends to be sometimes some less use. But games are popular with the younger generations in particular, but pretty much everyone so far. Also pretty interesting gender dynamics in terms of like who likes which games and stuff, but broadly popular across gender, which is nice to see, and something where the industry has come along a bit to not just cater to stereotypes for who they thought liked games before. In terms of collection development, we'll talk a little bit about some of the factors that can go into that, but it's not necessarily substantially different from other types of collection development as you think about what types of resources serve your community. Thinking about what types of events, there are, of course, different options quite a bit. There are circulating collections, and some of those see a lot of use. There are some caveats with that, just in terms of what gets tricky to manage. But there's a lot going on there in the interesting space and a lot of successes. There are, of course, events, and there are a variety of types of events. There's the standard, let's learn and play a board game together. Maybe we do it regularly. I saw at least one person in the chat having some good luck with that. And some of those can be quite popular, successful, different ways to engage with the community. There are more specific types of events. I've seen some interesting ones that tie in book clubs with games and do some pairings that way. There's a books, what do you call it? Anyway, a board game store where you come in and play the games in Madison, blanking on the specific terms that they use to describe themselves, but like a board game cafe. So you come in, you buy some food, and then you play the games for free, or you pay a little bit to rent some of the games for a while. Things like that. And they do some creative ones where they have like board game matchmaking night, like as a speed dating night, or you play different games with different folks and get to know people. And I think they have more platonic ones and more romantic versions and things like that. So that's been fun to see. So there are a lot of different models out there. We'll talk a little bit about that later. The when part can be tricky as you think about what type of thing you're doing. I would say often board games take longer than you expect because there's the setup time and the learning time and then the play time. And if people haven't played the game before, then the estimated play times are going to be overly optimistic. And there have definitely been games that I've played where the setup and teaching time end up being far longer than the game, and that is not a great experience. So do some prep work to figure out how much time you actually need. And then depending on your audience, it can change a lot. If you're working with young folks, with kids, an hour, you can do a lot in. At the higher complexity end of the spectrum for adult game nights and stuff, 2 hours might not be enough, because some of these games take about 2 hours and have considerable setup. Usually if it's a game that takes that long, there are usually a lot of fiddly bits and pieces and lots going on there. So it can vary. 2 hours seems like a fairly popular sweet spot to hit a variety of different things, but depends on complexity level. We'll talk about that a little bit more. The where piece, you probably have some good intuitions about this. Just bear in mind, some games can be quite loud, and that can have an impact as you think about where these go. So similarly, in terms of collection, where does it live? People have done some really different strategies. Some folks don't want people to have the ability to rifle through the games on the shelves because that can lead to mess and lost pieces. And so they might have more of like the cardboard cutout of it, or more like DVD type case for it there. That can lead to confusion or people not finding the games so much. So the different types of trade-offs there. But there's no right or wrong answer for what's going on there. So let's start getting a little bit more specific. In the interest of alliteration, I threw together a handful that I think capture some of the key parts to think about. as we go through this. So replaceability, obviously lost items are going to be a big concern, especially if you have a circulating game collection. Some of these games have 1,000 pieces, so that's probably not going to be a great fit for a circulating collection because it's so easy to lose things and so hard to know if something has been lost. But it varies depending on these games, how easy something is to replace. If you're playing a game like Dixit, where it's all beautiful art cards, it's a bummer if some get lost, but it will not break the game at all because you still have quite a deck of cards and they all are pretty interchangeable in terms of their function, as opposed to if I'm playing poker with friends and I happen to have lost all of the aces up my sleeves, people get mad for some reason because those are not seen as interchangeable with the other cards, turns out. Similar with like chess and specialized pieces. And then it depends also, right, on how easy they are to replace. If it is just cards, then maybe you can get by in a game with just printing off a new one because you can use some paper stock and sometimes that is fully functional. If it has just pretty standard pawn pieces, the technical term for which is meeples, which I approve of, those can be pretty easy to buy lots of spare meeples and to have those on hand to be able to swap in and out for different games, right? If you lose the shoe in Monopoly, that does not break the game. So, but think about these. A lot of this you can pick up on. There's a lot of great video tutorials and setup things on YouTube. And so a lot of times if you watch through the setup of the game, you'll be able to get some sense for how vital different pieces are, how easy they would be to replace if they get lost, things like that. I will say a number of board game publishers are good about sending free replacements. Definitely not all of them, and this changes over time. Some companies used to be great and aren't now, and vice versa. But it's not unusual, certainly, to be able to write to them and say, hey, we did lose this key piece. Can you send us some replacements? So that's pretty fantastic. Other times, you might have a backup copy of the game that you can scavenge pieces from to spread to a variety of other ones. If you have a 3D printer, that gives you some really interesting options as well, too. I've heard some libraries having really nice success with that for printing pretty thoroughly matched parts to missing ones. There is, of course, the rules and difficulty of part as we think through that teaching process. And teaching board games is a skill and takes some practice in many cases, and is one to be prepared for an event. If you have an event where you don't have teaching set up ahead of time, then has a pretty high likelihood of kind of floundering and bogging down, just as people dig into trying to learn the game. And some of these have very long books and sets of rules, depending on how it goes. Not necessarily bad games, some of which makes actually a lot of sense pretty quickly once you start playing, but getting that momentum can be pretty challenging to build that back up. I know a lot of libraries do copy the rules when you first process a game. Intake it, a lot of libraries will take pictures of the cover to add to the system for checkout and discovery, the instructions, maybe scan flat pieces like cards, etc. I am not a lawyer, so I'm not going to give a particular clear answer on that one. I'm a big believer in fair use, though, as a concept, and one that librarians, I think, are some of the few folks who recognize that that's a concept that needs to be kind of constantly defended from copyright creep and trying to find what is a healthy balance for our society on that one. So you can certainly make some pretty strong arguments for some of those, but yeah, your particular comfort level with that may vary. When we're thinking of the rules and the difficulty, one of the resources that will keep coming up is Board Game Geek, the website, and they do have a complexity rating from a scale of like 1 to 5, might go down lower than 1 to like 0 to 5, but you'd never see anything at that end. So functionally, it's like a 1 to 5 rating for how difficult it is, and that can give you some sense for it and just how complicated it is to learn and set up and play and things like that. There are, of course, ratings. Again, Board Game Geek, among other places, can be a really nice way to see what the aggregate ratings are and how people tend to enjoy those. I have another slide, I think, where I break down a little bit more for what I think those translate to in the real world. Replayability, not as much of a major factor, but there are some games that are only made to be played once, which is very creative and cool, and may or may not make it a good one to purchase. It might be good to purchase if it's actually playable multiple times. It's just not meant to be played by the same people multiple times because you know the answer to the mystery, whatever it is, if there's a bit more structure to it. That is a thing that exists. Or some games are like, there's some legacy games where it's like you actually change the board game as you play. It might be that like, oh, this character got murdered and betrayed. You rip up their card. It is gone. And you put this sticker on the map to show that this city is currently on fire. And things like that. They can be really great games. but watch out for those because they're probably not going to fit your usual needs in terms of purchasing it. I see at least one question coming in the Q&A. I will get to that in just a bit. Thanks for asking. So diving in a little bit more to the when piece, which we talked about a little bit. So you want to pad it for that learning time and for new players being much slower than experienced players. So it can also be great if you have some ability to seed a group with people who know what they're doing versus newbies. But it depends. Also, if a bunch of people know the game well and can play it effectively and efficiently, and someone else is struggling just to figure things out, that's not always the best experience either. So it varies. Definitely pad it based on number of players. Almost all games get much slower the more players that you add, which makes sense, right? Just based on turn time. There are, in the document that I've shared at the end, some games that I think work well for larger groups, which usually means up to like 8 players, because those are hard to find. Usually things really slow down as you add more folks. And thanks, I see some good resources in the chat, especially around some of the D&D and other campaigns there. We're not going to get too much into the tabletop games today because they're different enough, but they can be a really great resource for the library and really devoted followings and interactions. So again, lean on YouTube at least a little bit if you're trying to learn how to teach a game effectively, because there are a lot of people that do this, and there's a good amount of them that do it pretty well. But getting it into a condensed period of time is still a challenge. I've heard different people take very different stances on whether or not it's great to have patrons bring in their own games, right? There's some risk for if the game gets damaged, and some of these games are expensive. How do you want to handle that? Things like that, or do you just use games that the library already owns? So your results may vary there, but often there are people in your community who will be passionate about this and who probably have some decent sized collections, which may have opportunities either for donations, because which games people like to play can change quite a bit over time, or to bring things in for the events. Another type of event I want to highlight briefly, there are tournaments in some forms, right? So like the Pokemon card game, not one of the things that was projected to be still popular 20 plus years later, but Pokemon remains everywhere, and the card game is popular. So collectible card games, CCGs, are ones where it doesn't necessarily make sense. It doesn't normally make sense for the library to own a lot, because it's about people building up their own individual decks so they can play. But sometimes that means they want a tournament to play at, or an opportunity to trade cards with other people, or otherwise socialize around that as an activity. And then there are also like some more intense like war games like Warhammer, where it's all, you paint the figures and then you move them around the maps in battle. There's a Star Wars one, things like that. But those tend to be a bit more tournament oriented than other game type settings. Let's see, good stuff going on in the chat. If you are checking out board games, obviously that's a little bit higher difficulty curve. One of the ways people handle things, some people like to weigh the games. I'm a little bit skeptical. I like the Indiana Jones reference here, right? Trying to see, does this feel actually right, or will I be crushed by a boulder if I assume this is the same weight? So often weighing games not going to give you the level of precision that you need, because again, if those aces have vanished from the deck, you're not necessarily going to pick up on that by weighing it. There's some games where I imagine this can work for, but I can't think of a lot of examples specifically. Maybe ones that are pretty figure intensive, more of the chess type end of the spectrum, then it might work. This is a instruction page from Villainous. So the Disney villain game, someone had recommended that one earlier. And it's definitely the type of thing that you would want to have in your record, so you know exactly what is in the box. And a lot of games do a good job spelling this out at the start. A lot of libraries still find it worthwhile to type out a quick piece of paper that you can tape into the box so you can keep track quickly to inventory. Is anything missing? How do I know? To have things structured in a way that it's you've got bags for each thing, so it's easier to see where everything fits together. Most patrons are good about returning most things most of the time, high level of that. And I've heard pretty good results from people who, if a game comes back missing a piece and you notice that it's missing a piece, reaching back out to the patron, and often they'll be able to find and replace it. I have seen different libraries handle it different ways in terms of charging for missing pieces. And again, it probably depends on how hard it is to replace that piece. If it's a pawn you can swap out, great. If it's something you can get free from the company, fantastic, though that can take a bit. Or needing to charge. And occasionally a game will come back that is just fully unplayable because it is missing too many pieces. So that is worth thinking about and having a clear policy on ahead of time. Because again, it's not going to be most of the time, but there's that risk. And that also can affect the audience some too, right? The 5-year-olds who are enthusiastic about playing the game of Operation. My kids were playing yesterday, right? Where you do surgery on this hapless person to take out random things from them. Really easy to lose those little pieces, and people in that age category are not the best at keeping track of those. Yeah, so it depends. I do know a few places that just fully trust patrons to return all the pieces and don't inventory it every time. That seems to be kind of rare because it's inevitably things are going to get lost semi-regularly. But inventorying these games as they come in can be quite a bit of work depending on the size of them. So that's another thing to really factor in as you're thinking about which games might be a good fit. How much is there to count each time they come in? How much there is there to organize? And how broken are things if things are missing? So I would say those are the biggest concerns and what stops a lot more places from doing this. So think through that from a time approach. And like we mentioned, 3D printers can be a great way to get those pieces back as well. So a little bit more on checking out. Labels, right? You want to have these labeled so it's clear that this belongs to your library if you're circulating these. The difficulty is really good to highlight because you can judge a board game by its cover only so much. And oftentimes it can be pretty not reflective of how difficult the game actually is. Examples where it's like, oh, the dinosaur game gets checked out all the time, but then not actually played because it turns out this is not the 5-year-old end of the dinosaur spectrum, even though it looks super cool and stuff like that, but it will take 2 hours to play and set up and to read the massive instructions. So having things organized one way or another, whether visibly via sticker, which is what a lot of places do, or otherwise in terms of shelving, in terms of difficulty, is worth a lot. It makes your patrons better able to find what they're actually looking for and avoid some of those frustrating mismatches. Thanks for the great tips and examples in the chat. Return policy mentioned a little bit, and that's been done a lot of different ways. So I don't have a necessarily clear best practice for you, but in terms of what you're finding works well. In terms of fines or replacements for your library for other things may carry over decently well. Similar with in terms of checkout time or how many things can be checked out. There's a whole spectrum for what different libraries have found success with in that one. Definitely have backups of instruction manuals. Often these can be found online, where it's just the PDF is available from the publisher or something like that. But make sure one way or another that you have a backup of instruction manuals for if a dog gets into those or if they just wear and tear their way down through a smaller lifespan. Rubber bands can be really nice, right? Where you get the H bands. Yes, exactly. Thank you, Hannah. To hold the games shut. Those are really useful. Especially for just depending on what level people can look at the games before checking them out. They sell sleeves for cards, right? Transparent sleeves that you can put all of your cards through really reduces wear and tear on cards. Not a must-have, but it can be nice, especially for games that have a higher level of use of the cards. So I know some people who swear by those. I do recommend beware the book drop. People will sometimes assume you can return games through the book drop, and that usually ends poorly. The inside of the boxes can really look like an earthquake hit after one of those. So that's also worth highlighting somewhere very visibly. Let's see, here are some great examples that I got from Assistant Director Allison Pustro at Tomahawk Public Library. So shout out to her for what some of these can look like. So you've got some nice stickers, you've got a clear inventory on the front. King Domino is a great game that's pretty flexible. Well, thanks, Chris. Great point. And other just print out instructions so you just know what is in the box and how you can quickly cycle through to see what's there, what might be missing. So again, have backups of everything, know what it should look like, know what's missing. Often folks scan the instruction manual or things like that, or at least the pages that list out what's out there. Here we go. This I wanted to point out. I have not actually played this game, but obviously thematically appropriate. Get really loud librarians. And so this is highlighting what things look like on Board Game Geek if you haven't used that before. So up top, we see what the game looks like with kind of its main specs. Inside that blue hexagon, we see the rating, so 6.2. My personal level of balance is that things that are 6+ are probably decent thing, especially once you get more into the mid sixes, 6.5. It's just worth noting on site like this, the reviews tend to be pretty granular, right? You do actually care about the decimal points. There can be a big difference between a 6.1 and a 6.9. Lower than a 6 is usually a little bit of a red flag for me. Not necessarily bad games, but they are going to take a hit in terms of popularity in many cases. So then 7s are good. So 6s, fine, good. 7s are good. Upper 7s tend to be great. Award-winning games might still have like a 7.5 type of rating. And then 8s tend to be superb. So the highest rating game on the site of all time is at an 8.4. Just to help balance some of those metrics. And then I like they've got a pretty detailed tagging system here as they classify games in terms of mechanism, sometimes in terms of theme, who it's for. So this is worth poking around. Great question about highest rated game of all time. That is actually a trivia question coming up. So think about it. So, but Board Game Geek, good starting point if you're trying to find more information about games. And a good place to have people answer questions about like the rules, to have often be able to find the instructions if those are missing or things like that. Let's see. So a little bit more about building collections. So went with Pokemon, got to catch them all theme. Obviously, we've talked about how many thousands of games come out a year. So don't actually try to catch them all. No one can afford that. Literally no one. The rating for Board Game Geek is crowdsourced to Board Game Geek users primarily. I think they've got a couple of different ways to weight that, but generally anyone through the site. So think about it kind of more like a Goodreads for board games in terms of how those get handled. A lot of game stores exist all over now. That is a frequent thing that happens. Madison has an abundance of these, so I don't necessarily know what the average level is because I feel like we're probably a bit of an outlier, but there are a lot of game stores around. And a number of libraries have had good success partnering with them in different ways, sometimes getting donated games, sometimes help hosting events where you have someone from the store come in to be able to teach the games, the new games, or bring them in just for the event, things like that. So those can be really nice allies in trying to get this out. Sometimes publishers donate as well. This will vary a lot over time and by who you ask, but I definitely know of librarians who wrote to 100 publishers and got 30 to 40 games back for free, just donated. Not necessarily easy, because that's quite a bit of a writing campaign, reaching out to people. There are also conferences where you might be able to run into some of these folks, so that can happen. There are, as mentioned, a lot of times patrons or people local to your area who might have games that turn over time that they want to donate. The quality level there can vary quite a bit, so just make sure you think about when that's worthwhile for you, and if there's a banged up copy of a game that still has all of its pieces, is that worth loaning out for your library or not? And I have seen librarians come to different conclusions on that. I would say normal prices for board games are often in the $30 to $50 range. So again, not the cheapest hobby. There are cheap games that can be as low as like $10, especially for smaller games and social games. The most I've seen for an actual like popular game would be like the $200 range for like a giant Gloomhaven type game that will take up multiple tables in practice. So it depends. Yeah, Wingspan has gone up. Wingspan was on my list of recommendations and I pulled it because it's just gotten too expensive. And I'm hoping they do another print and that lowers the prices again or something like that. But as the supplies vary and circulate, we'll see. I haven't tried Wormspan yet, but that does look like a fun re-implementation. We want to think also about the accessories. So there's plenty of games that require dice and pen, at least for pen, like for scorekeeping at the end. Dice are common and easy to lose and pretty easy to have a good collection of on hand, especially if you're going to do tabletop role playing. A lot of times having a good stock of the various types of dice, D4s through D20s, depending on how many different sides there are worthwhile because a lot of people don't own those and that they can be very versatile for a lot of those different games. But yeah, look ahead, see what supplies you will need if you're running events and what type of events you're doing. I know a lot of libraries also have some good luck fortifying the corners of the boxes with tape, worth keeping in mind because those can definitely wear down. The bonus factors, because I had like my 4 R's earlier, and that really doesn't hit everything at all. So I added in a little bit more up here. We've talked about the importance of playtime and the setup and learning times. Don't undervalue those if you're doing these things in person. The number of players. So now I'll jump back to Beth's question. How do you handle an event to teach and play a game in terms of having enough seats for everyone to play? Multiple copies of the game is certainly an option, but not always feasible. Absolutely. Great point. Yeah, it depends. And if you have multiple games going of different games, then that can be kind of awkward just from a timing perspective, because one of the games might last twice as long as the other. And so it varies. If you are able to logistically have multiple copies of the same game, that can work really well in terms of the teaching side and the setup. But expecting number of seats, especially early on as you're doing these events, is a gamble, and trying to figure out how many people are going to come. Interesting example actually from Play, Make, Learn. Chris, shout out to Chris Baker from DPI, helped get a bunch of D&D librarians to come in and host D&D. And so we had a variety of different tables, but we weren't sure how many people to expect. And so we consolidated some tables and had people team up, and we'll see how that goes. And so some games are more flexible in terms of number of players also, which is really worth considering for some of these. But for the most time, for events, I would say, from what I've seen, usually there aren't multiple copies of the game reasonably available for a lot of types of games. Smaller games like Fluxx, great example, easy to have multiple copies of. Larger ones, not so much, in which case have a few queued up, ready to go, ready to be taught, ready to circulate, and let people self-select which one. And then it's great to have recurring events so people can come back and try the games they didn't get to last time, build interest in returning. Some of the other factors here, kind of obvious. Difficulty level, especially for some co-op games. There are some that are just kind of brutal, where you can expect to win 40% of the time. And that can definitely affect the play experience, or the difficulty as it connects to age, or just the level of brain power someone wants to pour into this thing. Are people coming because they want to chat and have a good social time while they play a game? Or are they here to like spend all their brain power trying to figure out how to get past this dragon? And those are very different experiences. There are, of course, tons of different genres of games. We'll dig into that slightly more in the next slide, and themes, and that can really drive people's interest too, right? So there's some players, at least one of which is a 6-year-old that I'm related to, who only really wants games that have dragons or Godzilla type things in it, and that's fair. Like, life is generally better the more dragons and Godzillas in it, up to the point that Tokyo is being crushed. So you have to bounce back that a little bit at some point. But some people are very theme driven, or some people are very type of game mechanic driven, where it's like, nope, we just want to play the social deception game to try to figure out who's the mafia, who's the werewolf, what's going on here. And that's great too, but depends on your audiences. But think about that as you develop a collection, to be able to hit some of these different needs and interest areas. And age and appropriateness can be tough to figure out. For example, the innocently titled game Puerto Rico, I think there's a newer version, but there was a version that basically featured enslaved people. So that's not great. As opposed to the more intensely titled game Blood Rage, which actually I think is decently appropriate because it's just Vikings and monsters. So do a little bit of research on these, like you would with any other collection development challenge. I would say as you market these, also a big distinction is between classic games. There's a lot of people who hear board games and think Monopoly and Scrabble, and those are great, but they are not necessarily what people are thinking of if they're thinking of newer games. So those can vary quite a bit as well. Competitiveness, again, what level are you going for? I have a good friend, one of my best friends, who's a librarian, who will not play certain types of games because she feels like she turns into a monster because she wants to win and crush everyone else, which is not in keeping with her day-to-day personality, but you never know. So think about those as well. The thing to keep an eye out for, there are some awards to help highlight what are some particularly good games out there. There's I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but Spiel des Jahres, so Game of the Year in German, because that's where a lot of the modern games came from, or kind of got kickstarted there. And the Golden Geek Awards are the Board Game Geek annual awards, and they've got some different subcategories and stuff too. So if you want a starting point, looking at the particular award-winning games is a pretty decent start. And that's a nice way to keep current too, since there are new awards every year. As we think about just the quantity of games, and shout out to Stranger Things here for starting a kind of renaissance in tabletop RPGs like D&D and other things like that. Those have really hit the mainstream and are bigger than ever before. There's a lot out there. I checked. Board Game Geek has 84 different categories and 191 different mechanics. So there's a lot out there. Some that I'm highlighting just because they're the ones that I see in practice a lot, and that there's a decent audience and patron interest level in the social deduction game. And these can be competitive or cooperative. But as you are, the main mechanic of the game is mostly talking to each other and trying to figure out who's the traitor or who's what or who doesn't belong or what is the situation, what's going on there. So there are creative ones there. Mafia is one of the classic examples of that one. Not so much a board game. I don't think you need any parts for that. But there are a lot of different versions of that. Ultimate Werewolf is I think, the upper end of that one. Secret Hitler is an interesting example of those as well. Good point, Dusty. Worker placement games. So you have your little pawns, your meeples, and it's all about figuring out where to send them to get the best system and strategy. Sometimes kind of an engine building game, right? Where over time you get stronger and are able to do more things by the end of the game. I really like deck building games that you start with a smaller hand of cards and you buy more cards into it to get a better deck that you shuffle through and work through. And that's a popular genre that also I'm just biased towards because it's one of my favorites. And then there's the full-on cooperative games where everyone is working together towards solving whatever the problem is. Like in Pandemic, trying to cut down the level of the disease and how it spreads and work towards a cure. Great questions, Catherine. Yeah, it's a whole bunch of variety. I will share a list at the end. But yeah, I've seen libraries do this in every kind of configuration. Ooh, too much scrolling. Rewind. There we go. CCGs, collectible card games, again, kind of a different category there. Not really one that I think makes a lot of sense for collection development, though people have maybe done it in interesting ways. Watch out for non-replayable games, also like the legacy games that are meant to be played once and kind of destroyed in that process, or at least permanently altered. Tabletop RPGs, again, bigger than ever. Not my main area of expertise. There are some really creative ones. There are a lot of cheap or small or free ones out there that explore all sorts of different concepts. There's some that are based around drawing a map together and kind of sketching out as you talk with each other how that country was formed and what happened and different things like that. There are heist-focused ones, and so it's like, all right, let's do our Ocean's 11 and let's rob a bank. And a variety of other things, as well as the classic Dungeons & Dragons, let's kill all the monsters. So here's Wingspan, just as an example for how some of those ratings might hit, but it is more expensive than I thought when I started writing this. The price has gone considerably, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Very pretty, though. And you can learn bird facts from it if you want, or do the dragon version. All right, last round of trivia. How long ago is the oldest known board game from? So type this into chat. No Googling, please. And what is the highest rated board game of all time? Currently, as seen on Board Game. Say that it has a whopping rating of 8.418, beating out Pandemic Legacy 1 and some other things. Go is a good guess. Bingo's got to be pretty ancient, too. Good guesses. Keep track of if you get these right, because there are prizes at the end. I'll give it half a moment more. Be precise. Chess is probably got to be one of the most popular of all time. A bit of trivia on chess that I appreciate. When chess became popular in the United States, a bit over a century ago, I think now, there was a lot of concern that it was rotting the brains of the youth, much like comic books or the invention of writing, for that matter, a bunch of other things. So there's a good legacy there in terms of board games. But I just think that's funny with chess in particular. All right. So have your answer in. The oldest known ones are around that 5,000 year mark. So some good guesses there. Really old. Senet is one from First Dynasty Egypt, where you find some in the burial. So like 3,500 BC, somewhere in that age range. So really old. We've got some Viking board games that are up there too. Dice have been around forever practically. So there's a lot. But that's what my mild to moderate amount of Googling revealed. So old, right? As long as there's been civilization, pretty much, there have been games is my guess. And that's decently well supported archaeologically, but it can be kind of hard to find these. The highest rated currently is Brass Birmingham. I do feel like newer games have an advantage, which is a thrilling game of like building canals and trains through Birmingham in England and moving around coal and other goods. It is a very good game. It is just a pretty random one thematically, and not what I would have guessed. Gloomhaven is third. I'm afraid Monopoly does not score super highly, but also one of the best known along with chess, right? And with a crazy amount of versions. I had tried to look that up as a trivia question, but it was just too hard to tell because there are so many different versions, and what do you count as a different version? Is it just a reprint or older or newer type of things? But so many different versions, thousands, probably like 3,000. So excellent guesses in there. I do have for us a sheet here. This is the short link. Can let me copy it without breaking everything? We'll find out. Always tricky while presenting. And I'll just drop that in. This is one I pieced together on a short timeline, so it's not comprehensive, even though I might pretend that it is. But it has some categories and some of the different factors you'd want to think about looking at a game like this. I should have added age in there more, because I didn't. I was thinking the complexity score might capture that better, but it doesn't actually. But take a look, poke around. Hopefully this is useful to you. And, that's a starting point, right? Where I try to hit a variety of categories on the cheaper end of games, things that are mostly not going to break too easily if a couple parts are lost. But it depends. And the way I rate replaceability of parts varies depending on, like, pawn is easy to replace because you can buy extras of those easily. And it varies beyond that. All right, back to slides. All right, so we've got our trivia. Some resources for us, featuring a picture from Settlers of Catan, one of the modern classic games. Of various resources. You can never have too many sheep, for example. That is a lie. You always have too many sheep. There's an ALA Games Roundtable that does some great work and continues to meet. They've got a virtual conference coming up, I believe. Shout out to Chris's WiseLearn group for Wisconsin Games Learning and Libraries. Good place to share resources and discussion board and chat. I really like a lot of the work from Jen, the board game librarian, who's active on Facebook, among some other places, some YouTube and stuff. I'm not sure if she currently podcasts. Board Game Arena is a really nice spot to try out games where it's purely browser-based. A lot of games are free to play on there and good implementations of board games. It's all board games, but it is also all digital. So it's a nice way to test things out. And there's a ton of games you can play for free, or you can pay, it's like $3 a month or something pretty reasonable to subscribe to their bigger collection with some of the newer games and things like that. I know one publisher in particular, Stonemaier Games, just has a standing 40% library discount. So kudos to them. I appreciate that. And they do really good games. I think Wingspan is one of theirs. Scythe is one of theirs, which is an award-winning game and very fun, but a bit intense in terms of complexity, at least to initially learn. But keep an eye out for those. And let's see, we are good on time, so I'm going to skip this scenario from Frosthaven, but I just think it's kind of a fun example of decision-making game. I think good games involve interesting decision-making. Is one of the better definitions I've seen. If you have done halfway decently at the trivia and are interested in a free digital game version of a board game on Steam, so it requires like a Steam account to use, just enter yourself in this form, and I have 7 free games to give out. A variety of different ones, and you can say no if there's none that you're interested in or things like that. But feel free. I do ask for your trivia score just to help narrow it down in case. But I really appreciate all of your time, and so I want to have that there. Spyfall is a game where you are asking questions to try to figure out who does not belong, because everyone knows the setting and what's going on. Like we're on an airplane flying somewhere, and one person is just faking it and bluffing. So you have to ask questions that don't give away where you are, but that unearth the spy. So I like that as a transition to a little bit of question time that we have now here in our last minutes.
Thank you. I was so busy looking at the chat, which is so wild today. It's so fun to see how much engagement there is. I don't know if there's any other questions that we missed. Things have been flying by pretty far. How about there's someone, can you show? the games to give away link again. I think that accidentally got shared with just the hosts, and I was just working on trying to
Oh, shoot. Thank you.
um
Yes, so it's on the screen and
there you go. Oh, whoops. Okay, I'm gonna try get that.
Thank you.
There we go.
Got to say, really fun seeing such a good turnout for this because I think it's a fun topic and I think there's a lot of room for growth still here in libraries. Ooh, simpler Dungeons and Dragons game. That is a good question. I am not an expert on that. I think there's a mouse one that's supposed to be quite good for that. But I bet someone else has a better answer for it than I do. Mouse Ritter. Okay, sounds good. Promotional words to get kids 6 to 11 to come play games. Interesting question. Not the age range I'm most experienced with other than having a 6-year-old. I'd say actually the art probably goes farther than the particular one. So if you can show really cool covers or gameplay, people like that. And and so some of those ages like some of the ones that you can get more hands-on and tinker with and build and destroy things too can be pluses. Let's see. Oh, Mice and Mystics, that might be the one I was thinking of. Yeah, Operation is great. Yeah, keep in mind, Play, Make, Learn for presenters and for attendance if you're interested. I hope to see a bunch of you there. Here is my email address. Feel free to reach out anytime if you want to geek out about games or for other things. I'm also working on putting together a course for AI and society in libraries because generative AI is weird and popping up everywhere for better and worse. So those are two of the topics I geek out about currently, but I always love connecting with librarians who are in the field because I don't want to end up too buffered from the actual real world experience and the awesome things that you all do.
Yay. Thank you so much.
So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. I again am going to note that David pulled this together in a very, very short amount of time because all the other presenters had months and months and months and months, and David had like a week and a half. So this is obviously something he knows a lot about, which is very helpful for that. So yay, David. And also I'm just going to highlight that Angela is a hero and collected all the amazing stuff in chat and made a Google document out of it. So that will also, she posted that in the chat, but it will also be available. We'll make that available on the website after the fact. So these, just to remind you, the session was recorded and all that will be available after the fact, and all of the slides with all the great links and that cool document that Angela made will also be available. So that's super cool. And if you are able to join us for our next session, that would be great. And speaking of games, our last contestant, I was going to say, our last presenter is Dr. Ben Chand, who was a 9-time Jeopardy winner. Next session, we have a session about assessing and adapting your programs to changing times. So that seems extremely relevant and helpful as well. And I'm just going to remind you that there's going to be a little very short evaluation survey after the fact, and we really appreciate your feedback. So please take the time to do that. Thanks again, David, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks all. Bye.